The U.S. is engaged in large-scale cyber warfare, and it seems like our critical infrastructure is more or less, I won't say undefended, but kind of undefended at the moment. How accurate would you say that statement is?
That's incredibly accurate. The statistic everyone throws around, although no one's ever actually furnished any proof that this is true, but it feels largely true, is that 85% of our critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector, and the government has no say, as of this moment, over how secure or not secure it is. We leave it to every company to basically fend for themselves. And now you're seeing ransomware attacks that are taking out pipelines and the food supply that just come down to a lack of two-factor authentication and bad password management. That's all it takes.
For people who don't know, two-factor authentication is like when I'm trying to log into my bank and it goes, hey, we just sent you a text, making sure that it's you. Please type in that 4-digit, 6-digit code. And there are people that are in control of like oil pipelines, power grid systems, water treatment plants that are like, I don't want to deal with that. I'm just going to use I've been using the same password for 20 years. Why change it now? Right?
That's right. I mean, even the Colonial pipeline, you have to give them a little more credit in that it came down to some employee who'd come and gone. I don't even know how long they'd been gone, still had an active account with access to their network. And that account hadn't been used for a long time and didn't have two-factor authentication turned on. So all it took was someone getting his stolen password, seeing he worked at Colonial Pipeline, trying to get into the network, and there being no obstacle to them doing so. And because Colonial Pipeline's network administrators weren't paying attention to some old employee's account, they weren't paying attention to the attack when they came in and started mucking around their systems and then deploying ransomware that held their data hostage in such a way that they couldn't actually see where gas was going off the pipeline. It's not like the ransomware hit the pipeline itself, but they're a business and they couldn't charge customers because their billing systems had been held hostage. So they took the step of shutting down the pipeline. So basically, because they had this old employee account that didn't have two-factor authentication turned on, an entire pipeline that supplies nearly half the jet fuel and gas and diesel to the East Coast was held hostage. And all it took was this old employee with a stolen password that didn't have two-factor authentication turned on.
And that seems glaringly, it's dangerous for that level of access to be sort of, it's kind of like leaving a gun in a room you never go in, and you go, well, we never go in there. Well, okay, but your kids are playing in the house. Yeah, but I mean, who would open that drawer? And it's the same kind of thing, but we're thinking, oh, but nobody has, it's kind of a tricky drawer. It's got, there's a key lock. Where's the key? Oh, we leave it in the keychain with the house keys. They're not going to open that drawer. It's sort of the same thing, except for we would never think that gun is secure, but we think, oh, well, that employee's gone, so no one's going to log into that account. Well, okay, no one nefarious. And I guess to their credit, sort of, Colonial Pipeline, the oil pipeline that was shut down, for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, they shut that down themselves because they were worried about what might happen because the other elements of their system were compromised. And that's kind of a whole other discussion about, was that the best way to have your systems connected like that? And to their credit, they shut it down before somebody could do something really horrible. But not all cyber attacks have ended with just a rush on gas that ended up being a big nothing burger. We saw a massive Ukrainian cyber attack by Russia. So take us through that a little bit. And also, why do this? What's the message to Ukraine from Russia here by doing this?
So the attack by Russia on Ukraine, and there have been several noteworthy attacks. One of the most famous was when they actually turned the power off to a large section of Western Ukraine for a few hours. And then a year later came back and did the same thing to their capital, Kiev, for a couple hours. That was a big one. But the one you're referring to is the one that security people call NotPetya. And it's a horrible name, and it's worth just lingering on it for a moment. The reason they called it NotPetya is because it looked like a huge ransomware attack that looked like Petya ransomware. But it wasn't ransomware because there was no way for the victims to pay a ransom and get access to their data back. It was actually just attack of destruction. So what happened was Sometime around 2017 or earlier, Russia breached a company that's basically like Ukraine's TurboTax. Actually, legally, most government agencies and banks and large corporations in Ukraine are required to use this tax software. That tax software company is run by a mom and pop just outside Kiev who never thought that their little tax software company could be used as a nation state weapon. But that's what happened. Russia's preeminent hackers from the GRU, their intelligence agency, came in, compromised the tax software company, got into the software update so that when all of these Ukrainian companies downloaded the latest, greatest version of this tax software, they weren't just downloading the tax software, they were downloading a GRU backdoor. And once they were inside, their GRU unleashed what was essentially a digital weapon of destruction. It looked like ransomware, which is just code that holds your data hostage with encryption until you pay up, only there was no way for the victims to pay. So all of a sudden, all of these Ukrainian government agencies couldn't access anything on their network. They couldn't access email or anything else. They had to hop on Facebook to communicate with the country to say, we're still standing. But it also hit railways. People couldn't get tickets on trains. It hit the postal service. People are still not getting pension checks that they were owed back in 2016, 2017. It held up the radiation monitoring systems at Chernobyl, the old nuclear site. So suddenly, the people at Chernobyl couldn't see how much radiation was leaking out of that blast site. But it also hit any company that did any business in Ukraine, even if they had a single employee working remotely from Ukraine, they were caught up in this attack. So it hit FedEx. FedEx suffered $400 million in damage from this attack. It hit Pfizer. It hit Merck. Merck's vaccine production systems were held up in this attack. It actually had to go tap into the CDC's emergency supplies of vaccines that year. It hit Cadbury egg chocolate factories in Tasmania. You name it. If you had an employee working remotely. Yeah. And so it ended up being the most costly cyber attack known to man. It was $10 billion in damages, although we think it might have been worse because a lot of victims didn't even report their damages. But it was really a prelude in some ways to a lot of the attacks we're seeing now. You know, if we had been paying closer attention to how that attack happened in the United States, we might have been a little bit more prepared for the SolarWinds attack that we're still unwinding right now, where another Russian hacking group, this time less of a destructive actor, thank God, broke into SolarWinds, which is a Texas company that provides software to more than 400 of the Fortune 500 and to all of our preeminent federal agencies like DHS and the Treasury and the Department of Justice and the Department of Energy and our nuclear labs, got into their software update. And all of a sudden, most government agencies downloaded this Russian backdoor. And we still don't know the extent of damages from that attack. We still don't know just how deep the Russians are into our government systems. But they also got into some of our electric utilities. We don't know what they plan to do with that access. So this is where we are now. You know, we are seeing attacks come in through the software supply chain. And for years, people have been talking about this threat, but now suddenly they're asking the right questions, which is how do you trust that any of the software you're using is secure and not a Russian Trojan horse?
Especially when you're updating. I mean, I update my apps all the time thinking, oh, I'm on the latest version. I'm on the most secure version. But if there's some fake update that I install, now I'm on the least secure version of that software that's ever been created. And it might disable my ability to update to a patch. I mean, it's really hard to say. I assume they did that. They went, well, okay, if they find out about this, we don't want it to then check the server for the latest undo. We want it to just not work anymore. And now you're in this sort of zone where you're going, how do I manually update my my Ukrainian TurboTax? Do I have to, okay, I have to delete it. Then I have to download the fresh version that's off their website, which I've never been to, and find that, and then enter my code that I haven't looked at in 3 years because I bought it ages ago, and you're doing that on hundreds of thousands of computers or millions of computers at the same time.
Right.
And it's pervasive. It does strike me as sort of like tragically comical that vaccine companies are reporting these losses, shipping companies are reporting these losses, and then Cadbury's like, hey, and we can't get any of those chocolate eggs out. Like we're going to be way behind this Easter for these little eggs. Just so nobody points the finger at blame Putin, okay? Don't look at me.
Right. And the only reason I ever bring up Cadbury in my list of NotPetya victims, and I always bring it up, is just because I want people to understand that we're so interconnected now that a targeted attack between Russia and Ukraine doesn't even exist anymore, because we're so connected that something, Russia decided to aim at Ukraine to basically take them offline ahead of their Independence Day would actually, cause disruption to a chocolate factory in Tasmania is really the best visual you get when you try and understand that cyber war isn't targeted. Cyber war can take all of us down at a few clicks. But we're not acting like that. A lot of nations are engaged in developing these offensive capabilities, but they don't understand that the collateral damage is usually their own citizens or their allies or businesses. And what's really interesting from that attack is, I mentioned some of the figures of damages. FedEx, $400 million. Merck, I think, had $600 million. When they tried to go get that money back from their insurers because they had cyber insurance, their insurers said, we have this tiny little clause in your policy that's a war exemption clause. And it says that if you are collateral damage in a war, we don't have to pay out. And in this case, you were collateral damage in Russia's war on Ukraine. And so we're not going to pay you out. And those lawsuits are ongoing. But American companies are on the hook for those damages.
That is crazy because, of course, it is war damage, but also it's like, well, when I signed that, I thought you meant if there's a drone strike and it knocks out part of our headquarters, you're not going to pay for that. Not an actual cyber intrusion, which is the whole freaking point of the insurance. So, and the insurance company's argument is, no, we're insuring you for when a kid comes into your office and installs some spyware and knocks out 50 of your computers and you have to replace them or you have to scrape that data. We're not paying you when the GRU, the Russian military sort of hacker intelligence unit, targets something into your collateral damage. And so now there's probably a whole different type of insurance industry out there with much higher premiums that says, oh yeah, we'll insure you against that for $350 million or more on an annual basis, depending on how big your company is. It's like this massive, you're paying as much for cyber insurance as you are for insurance on all your FedEx delivery trucks at this point, right? Because the damage is equal. Or greater.
Well, that's right. I mean, I and you live now in the wildfire zone, and my neighbors are getting notices that their insurer will no longer cover fire insurance on their properties anymore. And I think that's what's happening now with cyber insurance. Yeah, sure, they'll still cover Pfizer and Merck and FedEx, but their premiums are going to be astronomical, and there's going to be all sorts of fine print in there that says, if you're a target of this kind of attack, we don't have to pay out. And so this is something businesses are reckoning with. Now, the good news is that cyber insurance companies will say, okay, we'll underwrite you, but you need to have a much higher baseline of cybersecurity. You need to have two-factor authentication installed. You need to be patching your systems. We need a clear idea of what's in your network and how well secured that software is. We need to know that you have strong password management or your employees are using password managers. All of that. And so in some ways, it's creating market incentives for these companies to raise the bar. But there's another thing about that NotPetya attack, which I failed to mention, which is the reason it was so cataclysmic, why it destroyed so much, is because it was sailing on a stolen weapon from the National Security Agency. So just a few months before Russia launched that attack on Ukraine, someone, we still don't know who they are, they called themselves the Shadow Brokers, had hacked the NSA and had started dribbling the NSA's best kept code and hacking tools online. And one of the tools that they dumped was some code that exploited a vulnerability in Microsoft Windows that allowed their malware or code to spread automatically across a network. Instead of a hacker having to manually infect one computer after another, the NSA's tool essentially allowed them to automate this attack. So after that was dumped online, North Korea picked it up for a ransomware attack. That was pretty bad, but fortunately the North Koreans had made some mistakes in their code and someone was able to neutralize it pretty quickly. And then Russia baked it onto its NotPetya attack, which is why you saw their code sail around the world in the way it did and wreak that much destruction on companies, including American companies. And there's been no accountability for that. And people don't even realize that all of those damages were enabled by an NSA digital hacking tool.
The NotPetya attack. By the way, how do people name these things? Like WannaCry, Petya, NotPetya. How do the names come up?
Okay, it's a huge point of frustration for me. If I run for president, it's going to be like a single platform, which is cut out the ridiculous names for these attacks and for these nation state groups, because it's gone crazy. Like CrowdStrike is a security company and they name Chinese attacks something Panda, Russia something Bear. So you have all these names for these groups like Fancy Bear and Berserk Bear. And every cybersecurity company's naming convention is different. So anytime we call out these groups, it's like Nobelium, AKA so-and-so Bear, AKA APT2372. It's so frustrating. But usually the way it goes with malware or ransomware is that it's after some word in the code. So the North Korea attack that I mentioned was called WannaCry because there was some little snippet of code in their ransomware that said something like WNACRY, something like that. But really, it'd be great if we could get some central naming authority to avoid some of these ridiculous names and the confusion.
Yeah, I figured there was something to that with the code. The NotPetya attack, something like 80% of Ukrainian computers had to be wiped clean because of this, right? So that's massive. And it sounds like what we're worried about is not just how much damage that can cause, but the fact that that might just be a dry run for something even larger. I mean, okay, you went after Ukraine, it went and destroyed a bunch of data, $10 billion in damage. What happens now when you go after Canada and Mexico and the United States and Germany, which you can easily do? I mean, it's not like, I would imagine it's not a huge squad of people required to pull off an attack like this against a nation state. It's just they chose Ukraine because they knew they wouldn't have any consequences to pay as a result, most likely.
Yeah, well, it's pretty interesting. And I couldn't really wrap my head around this until I went to Ukraine and met with all the people who did forensics inside Ukraine on not just the NotPetya attack, but several of the attacks I mentioned leading up to it. The attacks that took out the power. There were attacks that were aimed at Ukrainian media companies. For years, they had been shelling Ukraine with all of these different kinds of attacks. But what was clear to the people who did forensics is that this was Russia really experimenting. This was their petri dish. This was them trying out one method here, one slightly different method there, basically like the scientific method of hacking. And so their theory on the ground there is that NotPetya, was designed to look like ransomware, but there was no way for people to pay the ransom. And that really it was just a destructive tool. It was a way for Russia to wipe the slate clean, to erase any trace of everything they had done before that, so that, no one would be wiser to the capabilities they do have. And what they said was, we believe that we weren't the ultimate target. We believe that we were spring training. We believe that you in the United States and the West are the end target here. But when it comes your way, we should mention that it will be so much worse because we are actually not that digitized here. We still run our elections on pen and paper. Our power systems are still pretty archaic. NotPetya didn't take out the power across the whole country. It didn't touch our nuclear plants. But when it comes for you, there is a high likelihood that it will do a lot more than $10 billion in damage, and it will take a lot longer for you to get your systems up and running because you're so much more virtualized. And by the way, doesn't seem like you're that secure either. So it was a wake-up call, but we're not really treating it like it's a wake-up call. We didn't change the fundamental ways we do business after the NotPetya attack. Most Americans have never even heard of the NotPetya attack.
they wouldn't even need to do much to do billions of dollars in damage in the United States. I mean, if you took down Amazon web hosting, which a lot of people think, oh, Amazon, you buy things there. All that backbone of internet hosting, there goes almost all of the services that you use. Or if you took a chunk out of, I mean, remember when Gmail's down for like a day and people are like, what the hell? We can't do any business. What if you took down Outlook and Amazon, or you just stopped airline traffic for a day or a week, like the Iceland volcano, except for the United States, right? And all you need to do, that's not even like kill people type of damage. That's just a massive, expensive inconvenience. Now you're talking about what happens if they shut off the power in the South in July when it's 100 degrees outside and no one can turn on air conditioning or a fan, and the phone system doesn't work, right? Because the cell towers are down, so you can't even call 911 if you're passing out or you need an ambulance. Like that kind of damage could be done by a few people relatively easily, because a lot of those SCADA systems, I think they're called, are from like the 90s, right? Those power grid systems. And they all, I remember talking with somebody who worked there a long time ago, and there are people that go, oh yeah, our systems are so safe. They're buried underground. You have to go in this tunnel, and the tunnel's flooded half the time to get there. Well, how do you control it? Oh, we hooked it up to a telephone line. I can log in from my phone. Okay, so you did that, and you never go down there for local access. You don't think anybody else can do that. And it's really shocking because these guys who connect the system to the phone line, it's like the young intern figured out how to do that. They didn't hire CrowdStrike to make their systems accessible remotely. They just frickin' plugged it into Zoom, basically. It's just really, really pathetic, a lot of the ways that these things have been made accessible.
Yeah, well, we don't even really have to use hypotheticals, because there was this situation over the winter when Texas power went out. Was it Escott? Is that the name of the company?
Yes. Yeah, that was it.
They went out, and everyone in cybersecurity said, oh gosh, is this the attack we've been waiting for? Nope, it was just due to an underinvestment in winterizing. If they're making that level of, or lack of, investment in winterizing, what do you think their cybersecurity posture is? And look at what happened. I mean, people they didn't just lose power in the middle of this storm. They lost access to their water because their pipes were frozen. I mean, that's really what it would look like. Only in this case, Russia might not turn it back on. They might make sure that the power stayed off. The one I actually worry about the most is water, because at least we've sort of wrapped our heads around the threat to our power supplies, but we haven't really wrapped our heads around the threat to the water supply. And, most of the water treatment facilities here in the United States serve communities of less than 10,000 people, and they barely have an IT guy on staff, let alone a cybersecurity expert. And just the day my book came out, actually, there was a hack on a water treatment facility in Oldsmar, Florida, just outside Tampa, where hackers got in remotely into the water treatment facility because they'd been using a decade-old version of Microsoft Windows that hadn't been patched in years. And they didn't have two-factor authentication turned on. And they hadn't even thought about this scenario. But a hacker was able to get into their chemical controls and up the level of LYE in the water from something like 1,100 parts per million to 11,000 parts per million,
Ooh.
which is enough to send everyone to the hospital in the middle of COVID when hospitals are already under strain. And oh, by the way, they did it on the Friday ahead of Super Bowl weekend in Tampa. So thank God some engineer was sitting at his computer and happened to watch his cursor move around and catch this thing in action. But, in most cases, there wouldn't have been an engineer sitting in front of their computer watching that happen. And, I was just at a wedding last weekend, and right next to our hotel was this little water treatment facility. And it was like, there is no way there is an IT guy sitting there on-prem watching to make sure no one's mucking around with their chemical controls. And I guarantee you, there's a very easy way for someone to remote into their system and up the level of caustic chemicals in the water. So, the scenarios are endless, and we keep having these close calls, but we're still not changing the way we secure our critical infrastructure.
I would imagine that software that runs those plants It's all the same stuff. It's all the same version of the same stuff. It all runs on Windows. Like you said, the Windows might not even be patched. That sounds like they just got remote access to Windows, and then they use the software like you can do with a screen share on Zoom or any other remote software. Imagine if somebody found out how to, I mean, I'm sure they already did find out how to remotely access this software, plain and simple, because they make these things easily accessible so that, hey, your IT guy, oh, he's a consultant. He lives offsite. Hey, there's something weird going on with our software. They give him a call. He logs in remotely and handles it. That is absolutely not secure. There's, like you said, there's probably one guy there just to make sure pipes aren't exploding, and they're on their iPad watching Netflix, and they're just looking for giant spurts of water squirting out. They're not sitting there going, oh, that's seems like a chemical imbalance on system number 7. Let me go look at that and inspect that. They probably don't even have anybody qualified on site to even do that at any given time. So that is terrifying, especially because you can log in and do that to 1,000 small town water systems probably all at the same time or within a few hours before anybody figures out anything and they can unplug the internet. I mean, it's just the amount of damage is massive. And then you have no idea who did it in the first place. I mean, you can point fingers, but that's pretty much it. I remember reading that in Ukraine, Russia pushed a lot of the anti-vax stuff that sounds very familiar here. They tested that on the Ukrainian population, said, hey, the MMR vaccine causes autism. And then there was a massive measles outbreak or something like that, right? Am I close here?
Yes, you're close. I mean, it was really disturbing. And again, I couldn't have wrapped my head around this until I actually went to Ukraine. But I met with officials at the embassy, and I was there to talk about cyber threats, hacking threats. But they didn't even have time to think about cyber threats because they were so focused on Russian disinformation in Ukraine. And at that very moment, there was this crazy measles outbreak that had actually spread to Hasidic communities in New York, because some of them do this pilgrimage to Ukraine every year. But a lot of it, Ukraine has a disinformation minister, something we don't still have here in the United States, but I met with them at the time. And he said, yes, they tracked a lot of it down to Facebook pages targeted at young Ukrainian mothers, where Russian trolls were flooding the comment sections with, trying to legitimize the vaccination debate and seeding doubts among Ukrainian mothers that measles vaccines caused autism or was some, nation state tool of control. And so a lot of young mothers weren't getting vaccinated. Meanwhile, back in Russia, the vaccination rates were nearing 100%, whereas in Ukraine, they were dipping below 50. And it didn't even hit me at the time, because this was 2019, that a year later, less than a year later, we would have a global pandemic. But sure enough, here we are in the middle of this global pandemic. And the biggest threat right now is vaccine hesitancy. And some white papers are just now coming up that are tracing a lot of disinformation related to the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines to Russian troll networks. And they're playing out on Facebook, they're playing out on social media, and this is where we are now.
That is, of course, terrifying because it affects the public health of the entire country. And yeah, the joke is really on us, because when you look at vaccination rates in Russia, well, why are they so high? Oh, they have an oppressive government. Okay, but they're obviously not doing the same type of disinformation that they are over here. I mean, is it... And of course, it's using our own sort of information freedom against us, and that's a whole different, probably, podcast here. But I want to go back to what you mentioned before, the shadow brokers hack and what this means, the gravity of it. I don't think most people know what 0 days are, why they're valuable. Can you take us through that a little bit? Because this is one of the main reasons that we're having so many cyber attacks, correct?
It is and it isn't. So just to back up, and I promise this is the most technical part of our conversation today, but what is a 0 day? So a 0 day is a flaw in software that the software maker is not aware of. And the day someone discovers it, that's day 0 or 0 day, because they've had 0 days to fix it. And until they can fix it, everyone who uses that software is vulnerable to hacking. So just to take the most simple example, let's say I'm a hacker and I find a flaw in your iPhone's iOS software, and I can write a program to exploit it. So that flaw is called a 0-day. The program to exploit it's called a 0-day exploit. And if I create a good program, I can use it to read your text messages, track your location on your iPhone, access your phone calls, use your camera without your knowledge, record all of your surround sound and conversations, your calendar appointments. That's basically everything a spy agency could ever want or need. And so there is a market where governments are not regulators, but governments are customers. The US government is one of the top customers in this space, and they will pay hackers to sell them those 0-day exploits. The going rate for the 0-day exploit I just described in your iOS software is $2.5 million. US government brokers will pay you $2.5 million to sell them that exploit, with the condition that you not tell anyone about it. Because the minute you tell someone, or the minute Apple finds out about it, they'll patch that underlying 0-day. You'll get one of those annoying prompts on your phone to update your software, and suddenly that $2.5 million capability turns to mud. So there is a long history here since the 90s of US government agencies paying hackers, both in the United States and abroad, to sell them these 0 days and the code to exploit them to add to their stockpiles. Now, in the case of, so I started writing this book about this because I was just fascinated by the moral hazard and the security dilemma baked into that marketplace. You know, we are all using the same software today. 3 decades ago, when these programs started, this marketplace launched, we were all using different software. China was using Huawei. We were using Oracle and Cisco for the most part. 3 decades later, Huawei is a glaring exception, but we're all using the same technology. We're all using Android phones and iPhones and Windows, whether you know it or not. You might not have a Windows PC, but it's in the power grid and your water systems and your pipelines. And same for industrial systems, Siemens software, Schneider Electric software. That's pretty much the market leaders when it comes to industrial systems. So when the US government finds a 0-day in that software and holds on to it and makes sure that it doesn't get fixed, it means that most Americans in our critical infrastructure, more and more so, are left vulnerable. So I was fascinated by this. I never in a million years imagined that the NSA's own stockpile of 0-day exploits would get hacked by someone, we still don't know who they are 3-4 years later, dumped online so that our adversaries like North Korea and Russia would pick them up and use them in these global destructive attacks. But that is precisely what happened. Now, the 0-day that was used by North Korea and Russia was called Eternal Blue at the agency, at the NSA. I do know from reporting that it was developed in-house. This was not something that they secured off the market. But that marketplace is alive and well today. Actually, the going rate for that iOS 0-day exploit I described earlier, you can actually get more these days if you sell it to a broker based in Abu Dhabi called CrowdFence. They're offering $3 million or $3.5 million for that same one that US agencies will pay $2.5 million for. And in essence, what that market does is it closes the capabilities gap. So 3 decades ago, the US was still the top player in the space. We were worried about Russia. We were worried about China, not so much because China matched our capabilities. We're still sort of the top dog. No one's pulled off the same level of attack that the United States and Israel pulled off several years ago. But they were just so prolific with their attacks that we were worried about that. What the market has done is it's closed this capabilities gap so that countries that have had very little in the way of offensive capabilities or engineers with the skills to pull off these attacks can now tap into this market and buy things off the shelf that years ago they would have had to develop in-house. And that's why I focus on the 0-day market in the book. But, you know, that is advanced nation state level cyber warfare. Unfortunately, on the defensive side, a lot of the attacks we're seeing right now don't come in through 0 days. They come in through just the lack of basic cybersecurity hygiene. They come in through stolen passwords and a lack of two-factor authentication. 80% of the ransomware attacks we're seeing right now come in through a combination of a stolen password or a phishing email and a lack of two-factor authentication. Although what's terrifying is that just last month, the Department of Homeland Security warned that there is a new ransomware strain out there that does exploit 0 days and does use 0 days. And that's very scary because those are almost impossible to stop until you figure out what flaw they're using and how to patch it and get that patch rolled out to everyone and get everyone to actually implement that patch. Because these days, so many companies are too lazy to even run their patches on time.
What about backdoors deliberately programmed into software? I mean, we've heard that, hey, don't use Huawei software. It's got a backdoor. It lets China sniff the traffic coming from any of your devices. You know, a lot of people say, oh, that's just BS. It's just non-competitive crap. But I would assume that there are backdoors deliberately programmed into many devices. I mean, why wouldn't there be? Especially when you're talking about like industrial, supposedly secure networking devices. There's a big incentive for a company to accept a nice $100 million+ incentive or something like that to put something in there that's never going to get misused. We're only using this for national security, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a long history there. You know, the most famous example was a Swiss company that offered encryption, and they were called Crypto AG. And we learned later that they were getting paid off by the CIA and the NSA to put a backdoor into that encryption software because their encryption was used by countries that don't trust American software, like Iran, Syria, North Korea, etc. And so the NSA basically went to them and said, use this backdoor, put this backdoor in your systems. You'll be doing, you know, your country and ours a giant patriotic favor. You know, we will cover your expenses. And that was, in essence, the way that U.S. intelligence agencies were able to spy on some of Iran's most sensitive systems for years before the Iranians discovered it and actually arrested one of Crypto AG's employees who had no idea that his employer was doing this. That was a long time ago. Now, the people I interviewed for my book wouldn't speak directly to any of these operations because obviously they're incredibly highly classified. But what they would say is that in the US intelligence community, there is a 5-tier, 6-tier system. And at the bottom are nation states that have basically zero hacking capability. We call them the script kiddies of nation states. You know, they might be able to pull off some silly denial of service attack, although these days they can tap into the market and buy some of their hacking capabilities off the shelf. Then in between, there are countries that have, you know, the talent to pull off these attacks. They might not be able to pull off a sophisticated attack that would turn off the power somewhere, but they could basically fill up their capabilities gap by tapping into the market. And then at the top, there are countries that can hack into technology and place a backdoor into the software supply chain and use that sort of Crypto AG model to spy on their enemies. And at the very top is the tier 6 guys, the top dogs who can do that all at scale. And they said that is where the United States is today. We are at a place where we can plant backdoors into global technology so that we can spy on these systems at scale in real time. And I had the privilege, I guess you would call it, of having a small slice of access to the Snowden documents. And it was very clear from some of the NSA and the GCHQ's documents that we were inside 2 of the leading encryption chip makers in the world. They never named the actual manufacturer, but they said basically we have full capability to spy on anyone who uses this particular flavor of encryption chip. So we know that the United States and our closest allies and Five Eyes have been doing this for a very long time. And we never stopped to think that maybe our enemies would be doing the same to us. But that is in essence what the SolarWinds attack is, the one that we're unwinding right now. You know, it's not them planting a backdoor physically into the hard drives or the encryption chips. But they don't need to do that because they were able to get into this cloud application used by so many U.S. government agencies and top cybersecurity companies and electric utilities to do whatever they wanted. And the good news from that attack is that the actor was the SVR, which is really a traditional Russian espionage group. They're not the same actor that turned off the lights in Ukraine and launched the NotPetya attack. They're known for stealing emails and strategy planning documents and that kind of thing. The bad news is we know the SVR pretty well because they actually hacked the White House and the State Department between 2014 and 2015. And when I went and interviewed the guys who were brought on site to remediate and get the Russians out of those systems, they said, we'd never seen anything like it. It was like hand-to-hand digital combat. It's not as if we would see a Russian hacker inside the State Department's network and they would scurry away. They would stay and fight to keep their access. At one point, they even hacked investigators' tools, the RSA NetWitness tool that they used to find further Russian backdoors, and manipulated it so it wouldn't find their backdoors. So that's the adversary inside our systems right now. And not only that, they were inside our systems for 9 months before a private company said, I think we have a problem here. So it's going to be at least a year or more before we can stand up and confidently say we've eradicated Russian hackers from nuclear labs, the Department of Homeland Security, the Treasury, the Justice Department. And that's a real problem because, maybe they don't pull off these destructive attacks, but we know that there's a lot of coordination between a lot of Russian nation-state hacking groups, and they could just as easily pass that access off to a group that is known for pulling off some of these more destructive attacks.
Yeah, if they have 9 months of mapping out our network infrastructure and saying what works where and credentials and everything, they could just say, we're done with this, we got the boot, but if you guys want to go in there and make a huge-ass mess and detonate a cyber bomb on a nuclear facility, here you go. Here's everything we know. Some of it's a little outdated, but the rest of it is probably still intact, right? We still know where all the facilities are. We still know what all the software they're using is, with the exception of maybe the SolarWinds has a patch now. But everything else, the computers are still in the rooms they were in before. I mean, we're not rebuilding those systems from scratch. We're just trying to secure them. So there's still, and any IP they stole, of course, is already gone. And so that is quite arrogant of us to put a backdoor in hardware or software and then think no one else is ever going to find this, especially when they might even be in the systems that we are using to plan the placement of those backdoors in the first place.
Yeah, and it really complicates the U.S. response. Every time I cover one of these attacks, I post the story on Twitter, and 60% of the responses are, why don't we just go shut off the lights in Russia already? Clearly they're not deterred from these attacks. Time for us to flex some muscle and shut off the lights. Well, that really sounds good in theory, but the problem is that people don't realize is just how vulnerable we are. So yeah, how do you respond to SolarWinds when, number one, it's the same kind of attack the U.S. government has been pulling off for years on adversary systems, on Huawei and Crypto AG and all sorts of others that we don't even know about? Do we really want to take that kind of activity, that kind of traditional espionage activity, and say, this is off the table? I don't think so, because we do it all the time. We've been doing it for decades. We've just been doing it better. So it's harder for people to detect American stealthy supply chain attacks. But the other thing is, how do you respond to an attack aggressively when you yourself are so vulnerable? And the language that I hear all the time is, we live in the glassiest of glass houses. So yeah, we might have sharper stones than others, but our adversaries can just come back and say, hey, they just blew up this pipeline, or hey, they just turned off our lights. We have the right to respond proportionally, which means we can come hold up the Colonial pipeline. Only in Russia, they have the luxury of basically outsourcing that kind of activity to cyber criminals or ransomware groups and saying, we had nothing to do with this. We don't have that luxury here. Any attack you see come out of the United States comes out of the NSA or Cyber Command or another intelligence agency. We don't have the luxury of saying, hey, Northrop Grumman, you go do this for us, or tapping the guy at Google on the shoulder at night and saying, hey, you're going to come moonlight for us. So it's harder to hide these American attacks through these layers of attribution and plausible deniability. And that makes escalation, that much more of a risk, particularly when we are so vulnerable.
You mentioned before the script kiddie countries buying nation state capabilities. I looked this up, this system called Pegasus, and I think, was it Saudi Arabia who essentially can send a text to like Jeff Bezos and they have full access to his phone, and they did that, and they got some, I don't know, racy underwear photos of the guy that made it into the National Enquirer, I think. this is scary because I looked at Pegasus and I was like, well, how much does it cost? I think a basic install is like 500 grand. So you don't have to be Saudi Arabia and have a $2 billion cybersecurity program running in your country. You can just be a really rich a-hole who's like, look, I want to blackmail this world leader, celebrity, whatever it is, because I'll make my 500 grand back. Are you kidding me? I'm going to make $4 or $5 million off of this by not releasing, or by threatening to release photos of the first lady or so-and-so on media. They're just going to pay this. So a $500,000 investment to a cybersecurity company to give me access to somebody's phone or multiple people's phones unfettered, it's like, it's an obvious sort of good, in air quotes, investment if you're a criminal. And I'm sure they try and screen it, but like, are you really screening it? Do you really look at the target, or you just hand over the install and it's good for 1 or 2 phones? I mean, I don't really know, but there's no way to detect it in the phone. I checked. At least if you're a victim, maybe if you're working at the NSA, they can take a look at it, but you can't find it. You can't defend against it. It just does what it does. And it's like, we're really this helpless. And this is a private company selling this. It's not a hacker where you pay in Bitcoin. You freaking wire them the money to Israel or whatever.
Yeah. I don't know if the Jeff Bezos hack came down to Pegasus, but certainly, we know that the Saudis used Pegasus to spy on confidants of Jamal Khashoggi. And that's part of the reason they were able to track his communications and find out he was going to go to the embassy that day, that he was picked up, tortured, and dismembered. And yeah, I worry a lot about Pegasus. This is spyware for your phone that's manufactured by this Israeli company called NSO Group. And they've been selling it to the Saudis. They've sold it to the United Arab Emirates. They've used it on a lot of dissidents and journalists. Mexico uses this. We don't necessarily think of Mexico as an authoritarian government, but a few years ago, I started getting calls from people who were reading my stories about Pegasus in Mexico. And they said, I think I've been getting those same messages that the UAE was using to spy on dissidents' phones. And all of these people started calling, and they were nutritionists, they were doctors, they were consumer rights activists. And it was like, why would these people have nation state level spyware on their phone? Well, It took a couple months, but I put them in touch with Citizen Lab, which was able to do the forensics to find out that, yes, they did have Pegasus installed on their phones. And what did they have in common? They were all people who at one point or another had publicly advocated for a soda tax in Mexico, where Coca-Cola and Pepsi maintain some of the largest market share there.
A soda tax.
Yeah. So here is someone clearly, if NSO says it just sells to governments, well, someone in Mexico's government was clearly getting kickbacks from someone in the soda or sugar industry and was using this nation state spyware that's usually reserved for terrorists and pedophiles and criminals, according to NSO Group. That's what their technology is used for. But here was someone using it to intimidate nutritionists from not advocating publicly for a national soda tax. So there is a lot of room for corruption and misuse of these tools. So when I went back to NSO Group and I said, hey, looks like someone's abusing your spyware to spy on nutritionists and doctors in Mexico. What say you? They said, well, we'll investigate. And I said, okay, so you'll investigate. Okay, so how do you know when your spyware is abused? Do you have any way of seeing how your technology is getting used? No. Okay, so how do you find out when it's being abused? Well, journalists let us know. Okay, well, I'm one of the 3 journalists who's written about this thing. So basically, it'll take me, a year to find out that your spyware is on these nutritionists' iPhones. Then I'm going to do all this reporting. Then I'm going to call you, and then you're going to investigate. Okay, let's say you find out that, yes, they were abusing it or someone was abusing it. What do? They said, oh, well, we'll stop selling to them. Okay, but this is hardware, right? You sell this hardware to these government agencies. How do you get it out of their building? How do you make sure you can't just go rip it out, right? They're not going to let you in. Well, yeah, but we can starve them of features and software updates. So it's clear that even when there is clear cases of abuse, there's no kill switch for this spyware. These customers in government agencies will just hold on to it for as long as they can. And we just see that same story play out over and over and over and over again. And that's just with NSO Group, which is one of the more expensive players in this space and one of the more sophisticated. But below them, there are hundreds of other spyware companies that are selling to countries that have even poorer human rights records than the Saudis and Mexico. And there's no oversight over this market at all.
Yeah, that's insane. The idea that it's going to take years to catch up and then they're going to go, well, that's it. We're not sending you the update patch that has the ability to change the app icons or whatever, right? Like, it still frickin' works. My parents are still using, older iPhones. They're like, I don't need an update. Okay, so what? We just let them have spyware hacking hardware that maybe in 8 years is unusable because it's so outdated. And then what? Another agency says, you know what? We fixed that problem. That was terrible. We fired that guy. He's gone. We want the new stuff, though. Here's a check. Okay, fine. We believe you because we want $45 million for the new shit. I mean, come on. Let's be realistic here. It's insane. I also know that a lot of these countries are getting hackers from overseas. You mentioned in the book that there's like shady jobs where they kind of fly you out to, I don't know, I hate to name a country and then they're innocent. Let's say Qatar. And they're like, you're going to be doing InfoSec. Great. Oh, by the way, it's all against dissidents and people that we don't like, and we're probably going to throw them in prison and they're going to die there. And then you're like, I'm going to head back to New York. That's going to be a no from me, dog. But a lot of people stay and take the check, right?
Yeah. And actually, just to Qatar's credit, they were actually the victim of NSO group. So what happened was
that's why I didn't want to name them. I picked the one like good guy country, or at least in that respect.
They're not really the good guys because we later learned that actually they were paying off FIFA officials to hold the World Cup and all this stuff. But
fine,
no, what happened was, what happened was there were these NSA analysts, operators who are start to get job offers from contractors around the Beltway who say, hey, we're going to pay you 4 times or at least double what you're getting at NSA. And we're going to give you all sorts of fun perks. Come join us. So they join them. They say, okay, we're going to fly you over to our satellite office in Abu Dhabi. And you're going to be doing the exact same work you were doing at the NSA. We're going to make sure that you're spying on terrorists and you're defending the UAE from cyber threats. Okay, it doesn't sound bad. And you're getting $400,000 a year. They fly over there. And at first, sure, they're tracking terror cells and ISIS cells in the Middle East. And that's pretty much aligned with what they were doing at the NSA. Well, then very quickly it became, hey, we think Qatar is actually funding the Muslim Brotherhood. And we think they're actually buying off FIFA officials to host the World Cup. Can you prove that? And these NSA guys were like, oh, okay, well, this doesn't sound too far afield from what I was doing earlier. So, okay, but I'll have to hack into Qatar systems. Sure, go for it. So they hack into Qatar systems. And the story one of these former NSA guys told me was that, here they are, they're getting into Qatari royals' emails and tracking their flight itineraries and seeing who they're meeting with and all the kinds of things that you would need to do to see if they're funding the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, at one point, Michelle Obama, who was then First Lady, was planning a trip to Qatar to speak about her Let Girls Learn initiative. And she's emailing personal notes to this Qatari Sheikah, and they're trading emails back and forth. And the person who's reading them is an American former NSA hacker stationed in Abu Dhabi who's like, what the hell am I doing here? And thank God he's one of the few to say, what the hell am I doing here? And left. But a lot of them stayed. And who knows what communications they've caught in their dragnet by now. But that's the state of play now, is that even, former NSA hackers who were trained up on our taxpayer dollars are now overseas spying on Americans, or whoever gets caught in their dragnet. And it's just a great visual example of just how out of control this spyware market has become, the market for hackers and their capabilities. That a former NSA hacker would be sitting there reading Michelle Obama's emails from some villa outside Abu Dhabi.
That is shocking because it just shows you that once they get, it's sort of like mission creep, right? I'm sure they got it to track ISIS and then they were like, whoa, this is pretty awesome. Why don't we use this for some other thing? I mean, just to see if there's an issue. We're not going to do anything. And then it's like, well, now we can look at everyone. It's kind of like, you mentioned this in the book, there's signals intelligence, there's human intelligence, and then there's like the joke, the sort of parody the love intelligence, where people are like, hey, I'm using this to track terrorists, but they're like, wonder what my ex-girlfriend is doing, right? Like, what is she up to? I couldn't find her on Facebook. Let me just, look, her credit score sucks. I wonder why that is. Let me just take look at this information. Wow, she got fired from this job. She's been up to no good, and you're just, and someone says, wait, you shouldn't be doing that. But wait a minute, what is my ex-boyfriend up to, right? So there's this mission creep thinking like, it's not going to be a big deal. And then it's like, ... you're spying on people that are supposed to have secure communication. You're using this to go after a dissident to keep a regime in power that maybe doesn't like criticism. And it's like, it's horrifying because it really is ... chopped up with a bone saw when it comes to this kind of thing. I don't mean to make light of that, but that's how this goes.
Yeah. And, there was a story my colleagues at the Times did, I think it was last week, although everything's starting to blur together in the pandemic, but about how the Saudi guys who dismembered Jamal Khashoggi received paramilitary training in the United States. And that was a big shock, that sent all these shockwaves out. Well, the same thing has been happening digitally for a long time. We've been sending our best and brightest over to Abu Dhabi and to Riyadh, and we're training up, their nation state hackers under the auspices of, the war on terrorism requires that our allies in the Gulf and the Middle East have these same capabilities, without thinking that one day they might think, oh, well, we have these capabilities and this person is saying some things on Twitter about us that we don't like. We're going to turn these capabilities on them. And, I tell that story at one point in my book of Ahmed Mansour, who we call the $1 million dissident, because any kind of spyware on the market has been found on this guy's phone. NSO Group's Pegasus, Hacking Team's tools, other European spyware companies, all of that spyware has been found on his phone. And what he said to me was, when I last interviewed him before he was locked up and thrown in solitary confinement, was, you might think you're just a voting rights activist, but one day you're going to find that someone somewhere has labeled you a terrorist, and they're justifying the use of all of these tools on you and your family. And you might not think of yourself as a terrorist, and every other country might not think of yourself as a terrorist, but it doesn't matter. At some point, you're going to get locked up and thrown in solitary confinement. And so to me, people like Ahmed Mansour are really the canary in the coal mine, saying, we got to pay attention to this. We got to have rules over who we're training up, who we're selling these tools to. I actually think the United States, as the government that sort of kicked off this market long ago and is still one of the biggest sponsors of 0 days and spyware technology, I actually think it's time for us to use the power of our purse to say we're not going to do business with any company that sells its tools to oppressive governments. And I think we need to rework our idea of what an oppressive government is. It's not just Iran and North Korea. It's the Saudis, it's the Emiratis, it's the Qataris, it's the Egyptians. We should not be training their intelligence teams to do this level of cyber war and digital espionage. We just shouldn't. And maybe it's inevitable they'll get those tools somewhere else, but we hold ourselves to a higher standard here. We're just not meeting it, and particularly not in this realm.
We saw how the shadow broker theft of all those exploits led to ransomware attacks on British hospitals, all these different types of businesses that had nothing to do with anything. They were just trying to extort money out of it. I mean, it really is kind of like proliferation. Once these bad actors get it, they're like, well, I don't care if a bunch of people in Britain die. I mean, who gives a crap? I want $4 million, I don't care. You're not dealing with necessarily rational actors that are thinking at the sort of nation state level. You're dealing with somebody who is the equivalent of me, but grew up in rural Ukraine or a small town in Ukraine. And they're like, so I never have to work again. They'll figure out the health thing. I just want to put this into play. And then it gets out of hand, especially when you get multiple players involved. North Korea has been hacking cryptocurrency exchanges to get money off so they can, I assume, so they can buy weapons and keep working on nukes and things like that. I mean, they don't have any scruples about selling weapons, chemical weapons to Syria, for example, if they can get money for it. I mean, they don't care at all. So having these weapons in these different hands is really horrible. But I guess that leads to sort of my final question here was, what would you say is the timeline for just a massive cyber attack against the United States? Not Sony, against Sony, stealing movies or whatever Fortune 500 companies, but against our grid, our critical infrastructure. I mean, where do you think it'll come from, and when do you think it might come? I mean, you've got to have an idea, right?
So this is the question I used to ask everyone when I first started covering cybersecurity. I'd ask everyone, I said, so how long until we have this cyber-induced, kinetic, cataclysmic attack that costs us lives? And 10 years ago, everyone had the same answer, almost ludicrously so. They always said 18 to 24 months, Nicole. We're going to see this in 18 to 24 months. And, it was just far enough that if it didn't happen, I might not hold them to the prediction. And if it was just close enough to add urgency. Okay. So now we're 10 years later. We haven't had that big one. And so it's not a satisfying
Why do you think that
answer.
is?
Well, I think a couple of reasons, but, for one, I think that we've sort of set up this very fuzzy, ill-conceived form of mutually assured digital destruction. Russia is very clearly in our power grid. We've caught them with their fingers on the switches. They've breached Wolf Creek, which is a nuclear plant in Kansas. They reported that a couple of years ago. And so the United States, a couple of years ago, we broke the story that Cyber Command had been hacking into the Russian grid as a show of force. To say, you turn off the lights here, you do anything to our nuclear plants, we'll do the exact same to you. You better watch it. So maybe that's held. Maybe that has deterred Russia proper, the GRU, from turning off the lights here, okay? But they're not missing the capabilities or the access. They have all the ingredients to pull this off. So I think maybe mutually assured digital destruction has kept them from doing so. So what I worry about now, though, is something much more akin to the Colonial pipeline attack. I think that actually laid out a new playbook. I think that, here was a cyber criminal group, we think, based in Russia that hit the IT system at Colonial Pipeline. So Colonial Pipeline, without billing, shut down the pipeline itself. I got my hands on a classified DOE assessment that said we could have only afforded 2 more days or 3 more days of downtime from the pipeline being offline before chemical factories ground to a halt because they couldn't get diesel or mass transit stopped. Really ground the economy to a halt. And so I think the playbook that was exposed there was Russia proper doesn't need to come bomb a pipeline here or use digital means to cause some kind of explosion on the Colonial pipeline. They can just encourage their cyber criminals to come after the companies that run our food supply, our water supply, our pipelines. They don't even necessarily need to hit the operation system itself. They can just hold up the IT systems. And then all of a sudden we're running out of gas and jet fuel and diesel, and we can't trust our water supply, and we can't get meat ahead of the July 4th holiday. Like all of those things just happened.
No Cadbury eggs anymore.
No Cadbury eggs anymore before Easter. All of those things just happened. It's just that we think they were Russia enabled, potentially encouraged, but not directed. But I think the new playbook is that Russia says, if we respond aggressively to any one of these attacks, I think the Russian response would be go to town, guys. Here is a list of the most sensitive targets that we already have access to. Hit them hard. But do it in a way that gives us a level of plausible deniability, but has the exact same downstream effects. And every single week, we get closer and closer to that. We haven't seen those ransomware attacks play out in any kind of coordinated way, but we're getting closer. And so, as long as there's a new playbook there, mutually assured digital destruction doesn't work. Because how do you respond when it's a private cyber criminal group in Russia or in Romania or Ukraine doing it? I don't know. And I think some of the interesting discussions inside the administration right now are, well, we went after Afghanistan. We invaded Afghanistan because they were harboring the Taliban. At what point do we go after a nation state because they're harboring this kind of cyber criminal that's causing this much destruction here? The problem is that we can go after them, whatever that means, take them offline, turn off the grid, et cetera, et cetera. But we still have to reckon with the fact that we're so vulnerable. We haven't even bothered to turn on 2-factor authentication. And Russia can say, well, they hit us. we're just going to go hit them. And then you get into this cycle of escalation. And that's what I worry about, is the cycle of escalation. And I think we're getting dangerously close to that. And I would say within the next 5 years, I'll be safe. I'm not going to say 24 to 48 months, but we're getting close enough that I think we're going to see a cyber attack within the next 4 years even that causes substantial loss of life. And we have not adjusted our threat calculus around that possibility. And we've not even adjusted the levers we would need to get to the place where we need to be in terms of our cyber defense. Anytime we've tried to regulate that companies meet a basic standard of cybersecurity, lobbyists have pushed it down and kicked it down. And so we're left in this very fuzzy place where we can recommend best practices for the private sector, and they'll take it or leave it. And so one of the small pieces of good news, I would say, in the last couple of months is President Biden signed a cyber executive order. And in it was a paragraph aimed at federal contractors that said, you guys can self-certify. We'll come up with a set of guidelines. You can self-certify that you meet those guidelines, that you have two-factor authentication, that you're using updated software, you have password managers, et cetera, et cetera. But if we catch you lying to us, if you get caught up in a ransomware attack that came in because you didn't update your software, you're banned from ever doing business with the federal government again, which in Colonial Pipeline's case, because their pipeline butts up against all sorts of federal systems, would have made them commercially unviable. So that's a powerful stick to get companies to really raise the bar when it comes to cybersecurity. So I don't know if it's going to work, but it's a clever way of working around our existing political landscape. And I hope at least, it helps raise the bar along with some of the cyber insurance issues that we talked about earlier.
Hopefully it doesn't just encourage the companies to hide shit and lie about it, right? I mean, that's another option. I can whoops, we didn't do that. Don't tell anyone.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, though, is that, another piece of that executive order is they said, we're going to create a national transportation safety board for cyber. Just like when a plane crashes and we do a forensics investigation of their black box, we're going to do that for major cyber incidents. So that's good. So it's going to get harder to hide. The other piece of good news is that ransomware attacks are really hard to hide because, for years, for decades even, companies have been burying their Chinese IP theft
Right.
and some of these, Russian probes. But ransomware is different. Not only are they holding company systems hostage and taking them offline, they're actually doing this double extortion scheme recently where they're dumping some of their data online and extorting them twice, saying, well, pay us once to give you access to your data back. Pay us twice so we delete the data we already stole and we'll stop leaking it out online. So that's made it really hard for these companies to hide these attacks. Just today, I saw a major coal company is now hit with ransomware. And the only reason I knew that is because their data started showing up on the Russian Our Evil Group's Happy Blog, is what they call it. And so, it's getting harder to hide. And so in some ways, as sad as it is to say, ransomware is a blessing in disguise because finally Americans are seeing the extent of our digital vulnerability. And finally, we're asking these questions that most of us who've been paying attention have been asking for the last decade, which is, why aren't we more secure? Why are we not meeting this base level of cybersecurity? Why don't we know what's in our government systems and in our software that touches our networks? Why don't we know where that software is made? Why aren't we securing it? Where are the grants to make sure state and local agencies that run elections can actually be convinced that they have any level of cybersecurity? So, in some ways it's good news, but we're in for a lot of short-term pain, I think, over the next couple of years until some of those policies play out.
Nicole, thank you very much. Fascinating topic, a little bit scary, but I think we all kind of need to have our head on the swivel for this sort of thing, because there are probably a lot of people out there who are using the same password they use for their Gmail or their Wi-Fi network on their SCADA command and control system for the power grid company that they work for. And you are the weak link if you are doing that kind of thing, right? You are the reason people might die because they can't turn on their aircon in the middle of July because you're too lazy to change your password, or you keep it on a sticky note on your desktop, or it's your birthday, right? I mean, we see things like that. These aren't just silly examples. We see real things like that. And now people are going to realize not only can it cost their company $200 million, but it could kill people. And I think that's something we need to be aware of.
Yeah, and it's a little bit like the pandemic, and that is another sort of piece of good news in that people are thinking along these lines. But solving the pandemic, governments can only play so much of a role. A lot of it came down to what businesses were doing, how they were able to continue to run their operations, the development of a vaccine, and then a lot of it just came down to us wearing masks and social distancing. And there's the added, similarity that a lot of people, because they couldn't see the pandemic, didn't believe it exists. And same in cyber. A lot of it comes down to personal responsibility. A lot of these attacks come through an employee's stolen password or them forgetting to turn on two-factor authentication or to update their software, whatever it is. And so until people realize that they have accountability, that they have an individual responsibility to protect their businesses, their homes, but also, government agencies to a certain extent, we're not going to get anywhere. And similarly, we have to get over this thing where just because we can't see it doesn't mean that this is a major threat.